Oh, wait, there we go. The mute button was on. There's a nightmare that speakers have of their packs not being muted when they go to the restroom. So I think I might have muted I'm not kidding, it causes me trauma. So I think I might have muted. Sorry, you guys, not my fault, just my fault. My PTSD from that having happened to me once. So good. Man, what a way to start the mornings. I wish every morning of my life could start like this. Just together in this beautiful place in the presence of God. Yeah. I will say the encouraging thing, though, some of you do, but most of us don't live here at Mount Hermon. Most of us don't live with 400 other Christians. Most of us don't have a live-in band that's really gifted that lives in our house where you go down for your coffee in the morning, they're like, glorify, that would be amazing. We don't have any of that, but the Spirit of God and the risen King Jesus is always with us in every place we go. And so this is possible that every morning begins, maybe not literally like this, but in the most essential way like this, And so much of what Kurt said last night, sort of pointed us to that reality. And there was so much Kurt said last night that my wife and I were talking afterwards. We were chuckling about things we were chuckling about while he was speaking. But more than that, I felt so, in a strange way, this mixture of conviction and comfort, The conviction at the reality of my life and our situation, and comfort in knowing that a better way forward is possible. I was really laughing so much last night when Kurt was talking about, all the beautiful sort of mosaic of different church traditions. And he was talking about the Assemblies of God tradition. And he was talking about, like an altar call, receive Christ every Friday night and then go to Denny's sort of thing. I was laughing because I didn't grow up in an AG church, but my youth group, my youth pastor when I was in high school was AG. He came from an AG background. He went to an AG university. So that was my reality. Almost literally every Friday throughout high school, I gave my life to Christ. So if you do the math, I've been saved over 200 times. So what that means is when we get to heaven, my mansion will be enormous. Right? While you peasants live in the cul-de-sac, I will be the 200X salvation guy on the mountaintop in the mansion. And then we used to actually go to Denny's afterwards. I was like, it was so fun. I was like, he knows my life. This is incredible. So amazing. There was another thing Kurt said last night that really was, in a weird way, a gut punch. And it offered me such clarity. I'm so grateful for it. When he was talking about this whole, when tragedy strikes in our country and this whole, hashtag thoughts and prayers and secular culture's sort of critique of that. We don't need your thoughts, don't need your prayers, we need your votes and all of those things. And in a brilliant, beautiful pastoral way, he sort of unpacked what that actually means, why that is, and the fact that, no, we need prayers. But more than the hashtag, that's the problem, is we type it into our social media feed and we're done. We don't actually pray. And that got me thinking a lot about why. Because, I like to stand here as a pastor and as a Christian professional and tell you that's your problem, but not my problem. The reality is, man, I struggle to pray as fervently and consistently, as passionately as I sense I need to, which is why it was so convicting last night when I heard that. And as I thought about it afterwards, as I thought about Kurt's words, I came to this thought, there are lots of reasons why I struggle to pray as passionately, consistently, and fervently as I should. Some of it is just laziness or busyness or exhaustion or whatever. Some of it, though, honestly, deep down inside, and I think many of us, if not most of us, will relate. You don't have to admit it, but that's my guess. Deep down inside, the thing beneath the thing, I think sometimes I struggle to pray because I doubt that it actually works. Sometimes I struggle to pray because I've been praying for 20-something years of my life, and it's just in some ways become sort of a rote, ritualistic practice. And I just kind of wonder, like, what is this thing? Is this even really doing anything? And as I thought about that, and then thought about going to Denny's after being saved as a high schooler week after week, I realized something. You know, my faith in high school was lots of things, and most of it was just social. Early on in college, I went through the sort of sadly now common standard deconstruction phase. My faith in high school was really, I didn't know it at the time, but it was really just, it stood up on these wobbly stilts of, youth group culture, not really genuinely a life of devotion to Jesus. But I will say one thing. When I was in high school, there was a part of me that recklessly and relentlessly believed that anything was possible. And then I grew older. Life got harder. It became more complex, more challenging. I started thinking more. I started living in my own head more, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but one of the things that it risks is it risks the loss of belief in possibility. And I realized that that happened to me. I began to doubt. I mean, I believe in Jesus. I believe in him deeply. I believe in the story, the gospel, the death and resurrection of Christ, new heavens, new earth, all of that. I believe in all of that. But in my everyday life, in my comings and goings, in my 9 to 5, in my time with my family, there's something residual inside of me, a sort of cynicism that's taken root. Like, yeah, intellectually, I believe in the God of the universe and possibilities and that he's able and capable and willing to do anything and everything. But in my actual lived life, there's a sort of residual doubt. And it's interesting because my kids are here with me. And my kids love water. They love going to the beach. It's one of their favorite things to do. And my daughter, especially, Harper, who's 7 years old now, every time we go to the beach, she will run as hard and as fast as she can toward the ocean. And here's the problem. She doesn't know how to swim. And so every time in my mind, I'm thinking like, girl, you have no idea. You're literally sprinting toward death. But there's a reason why. And here's the thing. My daughter is actually quite guarded and reserved and a bit shy. And she's so sweet. I love her to pieces. But like running toward the ocean it's not like conducive of like her actual personality. She's not really like that. But the reason she runs as fast and as hard as she can toward the waters, even though they are treacherous, there's only one reason. It's because Dad is always with her. Like, it doesn't matter that she is facing literally the ocean that could swallow her whole and end her life. That doesn't matter because for her, she knows that Daddy is next to me, and so all will be well. Anything is possible. I'm safe. And you and I, if we've been following Jesus for any length of time, particularly those of us who've been following Jesus for a long time, we can relate. Because there was a moment in your life when you were my daughter. And life was the ocean before you. And it was deep and dark and large and looming and treacherous and endless and unmanageable on your own. But you believed because God, your loving Father, was with you that anything was possible. And then you grow older and you go through pain and loss and heartache and you find yourself exhausted and you begin to believe a little less. You begin running toward the shores of your life a little slowly, cautiously, with doubt. Anybody relate? There's a story in Matthew chapter 14 where Jesus speaks into this reality. And I told you every morning I'm gonna ask you a question, or better yet, Jesus will ask us a question to ponder. And our question for today comes from Matthew 14. Now, before I read the text to you, I want to give you a little bit of the backdrop, the backstory to what is leading to this moment in Matthew 14. Jesus and his disciples have actually just received word that Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist, has been executed. This is tragic. And so Jesus and his disciples are in deep grief. They're mourning. And so they do what many people do when they mourn, when they grieve. They try to find what the Bible says is a solitary place, a quiet, lonely place where they could go and sit quietly in their grief. But while they do that, Jesus is already well known at this point. Massive crowds begin to follow them because these crowds want to hear Jesus teach and they want to see him do miracles. And Jesus, instead of getting angry, instead of saying, can you give me a little time? I'm trying to grieve the loss of my cousin here. Instead of doing that, the story says that Jesus has compassion on the crowds. Literally, that's the word. He has compassion on them, and he teaches them, and he heals their sick. And then this is when he does that incredible miracle of feeding thousands of people with a couple pieces of bread and some fish. You all know that story, yeah? So Jesus is exhausted and he's grieving and he's mourning. But instead of turning the crowds away, he expends even more energy. He gives everything that he has. He heals and he feeds thousands of people. And finally the day is done. And so Jesus' grief, his mourning, his exhaustion is now expanded to like unfathomable levels. I mean, he is exhausted and spent beyond belief. And then, this is what happens. Matthew 14, 22 to 26. Jesus made the disciples get into a boat and go on ahead of him to the other side of this lake. Talk about that in a moment. While he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, the crowd, Jesus, went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. And later that night, he was there alone. So Jesus is alone on a mountainside. The disciples have gotten into a boat out onto a lake. And it says the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. And shortly before dawn, so before the sun rises, in the pitch black, this is before electricity, right? In the pitch black of night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. Okay, before we continue in the story, a couple of points. First, the story tells us that the disciples, who are also exhausted, they're instructed by Jesus to get into a boat and to go out to the other side of this lake. Now, this lake is not like a little lake. It's the sea, it's often called the Sea of Galilee. I'll show you a photo of it here. This is just one small part of the Sea of Galilee. You can see that it's not like a tiny little pond. In fact, the Sea of Galilee is about 8 miles wide and 13 miles long. This is why they called it the Sea of Galilee, because though it's technically a lake, it looks from the shore like the sea, like an ocean. And because of the terrain here, the Sea of Galilee to this day is actually often affected by really choppy waters. Storms, many storms on the Sea of Galilee are pretty common. Here's the other thing to know. Jesus and his disciples are Jewish. And what you need to know is that the Jewish people were not and are not a seafaring people. In fact, in Jewish tradition, going back to ancient times, the ocean or the sea or large bodies of water were metaphorically representative of disorder and destruction and chaos and death. And so often in Jewish poetry, you will hear language about the ocean or the sea, and it's almost always as a metaphor for destruction and chaos. The open waters represented danger to the Jewish people. And so, Jesus' disciples, they are grieving and they are exhausted. They're grieving the loss of John the Baptist. They're exhausted from their grief and their mourning, coupled with a long day of ministry. And now Jesus has told them to go out into the Sea of Galilee. It's pitch black. It's the middle of the night. There's a storm and they're afraid and they don't know what to do. This is often how our lives feel. We're exhausted from loss or grief or pain or uncertainty or long, hard days of work, whatever that work may be, whether it's your literal workplace or raising a family or internal stuff you're dealing with, whatever it is. And we feel sometimes like we're in a small boat in the middle of a large ocean, in the middle of a storm, buffeted by the waves, and it is pitch black, and we don't know where to go or how to get there. You feel that sometimes, right? I do too. And in this story, something incredible happens. Jesus walks to them. That's not something people do. It's to walk on water, but Jesus does. He walks to them on the ocean, on the Sea of Galilee. And then in Matthew 14, verse 27, this is what he says. Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. This is really interesting. The three words in English, in the NIV translation, it is I, in the original language of the text, Koine Greek, it's two words. It's the words ego eimi. And actually, ego eimi translates not technically it is I, but rather ego eimi literally translates into two words, I am. Sound familiar? Jesus walks on water to his exhausted, fearful, anxious disciples in the middle of the darkness, in the middle of a storm, and he says to them, "Take courage, I am. Don't be afraid." Why does that sound familiar to those of us who've been around the church for a little while? Because those two words, I am, are the divine name of God himself. If you go all the way back to the Moses story in Exodus, here's what it says, Exodus 3. Moses said to God, this is the story of Moses meeting God in the burning bush. You guys remember that story? This is when God tells him through this burning bush, hey, Moses, you're going to go back to Egypt and rescue my people. I'm going to rescue my people through you. And Moses doesn't want to do it, and this is how the story goes. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent you. I am is the divine name of God. You know what's really interesting? That verse where Jesus walks out on water, the disciples are afraid, and he says, hey, take courage. I am. Don't be afraid. Those two words, I am, ego eimi, you will notice, those of you who are like Bible nerds, you know that Matthew is broken. It's like in the English, it's in 28 chapters. They're fairly even, not all, but most of the chapters are fairly even. You will notice this story takes place where? Matthew chapter 14, right? In the original manuscript of Matthew, in the original language, those two words, I am, they are almost dead center literally at the middle of Matthew's gospel. It's actually within about 70 words. that it is literally the center of Matthew's gospel. Most scholars believe that Matthew, in his literary brilliance, places these words at the very center in big, bright, blinking lights, essentially to tell you this entire story hinges on this reality. This Jesus I'm telling you about, he is the great I am. Jesus walks out on the water in the middle of the dark, and he tells his disciples who are exhausted and afraid, he says to them, "Take courage, I am. Don't be afraid." This is Matthew's declaration that Jesus is the great I am, God himself, right at the epicenter of the story. Jesus is not just a great moral teacher. He's not just an influential historical figure. Jesus is the great I am, the God who has come to rescue us from the storms of our lives and from the ultimate storm of death itself. Now, despite Jesus' declaration, doubt still overwhelms the disciples, right? 11 of them stay in the boat. 11 of them are like, it's a ghost. No way. There's no way. They believe that it is safer in the boat than it is out on the water with Jesus. But one of them, Peter, takes a step of faith. Matthew 14, 28 to 33. "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." Then Jesus says, "Come." Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand, caught him. "You of little faith," he said, and here is our question. Why did you doubt? Why did you doubt? And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down, and those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Why did you doubt? Why did Peter doubt? Peter has been traveling with Jesus for a while now. Peter has seen Jesus do miracle after miracle. Peter already has a sense that this man, his teacher, his rabbi, Jesus, is something other. He's different. Peter has an inkling that this Jesus is, in fact, the Son of God, the Messiah. We talked about that yesterday morning. So despite all that Peter has seen Jesus do, why did he doubt? Despite all that he knows, that Peter knows intellectually and experientially, why does he doubt? Despite all that we know, despite all that we have seen Jesus do in our lives, despite all the knowledge and information we have, why do we doubt? Why do you doubt? Peter doubts, and we doubt, because we experience the storms of life, and they're treacherous, and it is frightening sometimes. An intrinsic, visceral fear often overwhelms knowledge, even experience and history. We doubt because, like the disciples and like Jesus, we too have felt the sting of pain and loss. We doubt, like the disciples, because, like the disciples, we too often find ourselves exhausted. That's why we doubt. But I want you to notice something. Going back to Matthew 14, verse 31. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" The story does not tell us, "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" and then Jesus caught him. It says, immediately, as Peter began to sink, immediately Jesus caught him. Jesus did not allow the storm to overcome Peter. He did not allow the storm and the waters and the waves to consume Peter. Jesus immediately reaches out and catches Peter, pulls him up, and then he asks the question, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When Peter doubts, Jesus rescues him first and then addresses the doubt. I just want you to know something, because I know that doubt is a reality in most, if not all, of our lives in some form or fashion, whether we want to admit it or not. Your doubt does not keep Jesus away from you. Simply because you are not certain, it does not mean Jesus is far from you. Because you have anxiety and uncertainty and fear and the waves are large and life is treacherous, that does not keep Jesus away from you. Jesus does not wait. I love the way Kurt put it yesterday about all of the believers from various traditions. We have to love them because Jesus loves them, not because they're perfect, but simply because Jesus is love. And they are his people as we are. And it's the same idea. Jesus does not love you because you are certain. Jesus does not love you because you have it all together. Jesus does not rescue you after you have overcome your uncertainty, anxiety, fear, and doubt. Jesus rescues you in the midst of all of that. He sees you struggling in the storm, flailing your arms and your legs to keep your head above water so that you do not drown in the overwhelming waves of your life. He sees you there, and he does not wait for you to figure out how to swim. He immediately reaches out and pulls you up if you are willing to take hold of his hand. As afraid and uncertain and anxious as you are, all you need do is reach for the hand of Jesus with your doubt, with your uncertainty. Maybe you feel this in like real ways today. I just want you to know your rescue is not dependent on the strength or fragility of your faith, but upon the one in whom you place your faith. Tim Keller puts it this way: it is not the strength of your faith, but the object of your faith that actually saves you. Isn't that such a beautiful thought? That if your faith is like as tiny as a mustard seed, in the words of Jesus. Has anybody ever seen a mustard seed? No, you haven't, because they're so small. I mean, they're literally, like several years ago, I did a teaching at our church about mustard seeds, and I had never really seen one before, but I wanted to give everybody a mustard seed, so I ordered 1,000 mustard seeds because they were really cheap, and I was shocked at how cheap they were. And they came, the package came, and the box was like this big. It was like, they sent me 7 mustard seeds. And I opened the box, I'm like, oh, this is 10 million mustard seeds. Because they're just so small. And Jenny and I put them in these little envelopes. It took us hours. And then gave them to everybody. And then everyone was like, good message, and toss them in the trash. But either way. If your faith is that small, if it's that fragile, mustard seeds are also really fragile. I mean, they're easy to lose. You could step on and trample on. It's like, where's the mustard seed? Who knows? Even if it's that small, at least it's there. Even if you are ravaged with doubt and uncertainty, at least you're still here. And Jesus is closer to you than you can possibly imagine. Going back to that phrase, take courage, I am, do not be afraid. It's not just the middle sentence, it is I, ego I, me, that's in this sort of emphatic, almost non-complete sentence form, I am. Almost the entire phrase is set up that way. In fact, in the original Koine Greek of Matthew 14:27, take courage, I am, don't be afraid. The best translation would be, take courage, I am, no fear. It's almost as if Jesus knows the desperation of the situation. He knows that the disciples are afraid. And so he walks out on water in the middle of a storm in the darkness of night, and he just yells to them. I mean, think about how loud it is in the middle of this large, choppy waves body of water. It's almost like he just emphatically tells them in like not even complete sentences, but just declarative statements. Take courage, I am, no fear. That's what Jesus does here. Take courage, I am, no fear. You know, you've seen already from this text how much Matthew, the writer, alludes back to the Exodus story, right? This is actually a theme in Matthew. He goes back to the Exodus story all the time. And what's really interesting is, this happens to me a lot, actually. Matthew 14 would have, for the original audience, any story of treacherous bodies of water, for a good Jewish audience, it would trigger memories of the most important and central Jewish story about a treacherous body of water. Anybody know what that story is? Moses, the Red Sea. Right? It was like the Red Sea before them and the enemy Egyptians behind them. So it's like death in front, death behind, and God's people being led by Moses, they have no way out. They have no way out. And so the original audience of Matthew, they would read or hear this story of Jesus walking on the water in the middle of a storm. They would think, like, we know other stories about treacherous waters where death is looming large. You know, this happens to me a lot. Almost every time I go to the ocean with my kids, to the beach, I will stand there with my children, holding their hands with our feet in the water. And it's weird how often this happens, but often I will imagine myself in those moments as a dad, an Israelite dad standing before the Red Sea. I don't know why this happens, but it happens to me a lot. And every time I get internally really emotional, because I think to myself, what would I do? What would I have done if I were one of the fathers holding the hands of their young children on that day when the Red Sea was before me and the enemy Egyptians were behind me? When I was looking at death and when death was caving in and there was no way out, what would I have done? You know what I think to myself? This is what every dad and mom and grandparent in the room would do too. You're going to be able to relate. I would have taken my kids, strapped them on my back, and I would swim as far and as long and as hard as I could. But you know the problem is? We would have perished in those waters because I'm not capable. But my lack of ability would not stop me from doing what I could for my children. You have a God who loves you like a son and a daughter because you are his son and you are his daughter. And whatever seas are before you, he will strap you on his back. And he will carry you through for as long and as far and as hard as he can. But here is the good news. He is able to do what you and I can't. He doesn't need to part the seas anymore. He walks above them. Jesus will put you on his back and he will carry you to safety. And though you and I could not do that for our own children, God can for you. He can for you. So why do you doubt? I know you're exhausted. I know life is hard. I know some of you have experienced grief and pain and mourning and loss, and you find yourself at the end of your rope like you're running out of breath, you're running out of time. That relationship is broken and it feels like it'll never get fixed. The work situation or your family or that internal thing you're dealing with inside feels impossible to overcome, so you begin to doubt. But I want to implore you to consider today that maybe you doubt because you have grown cynical. Because the big, broad, deep, dark ocean of life before you has choked from you wonder and belief in the possibility that there is a God who can carry you through in ways that you could not carry your own children through. And this God looks at you, standing on the shores of your life, overwhelmed by fear and anxiety. And you know what he tells you? You know what he's saying to you right now? Take courage. I am. No fear. What does that ocean look like in your life? What feels impossible to you right now? Take courage. I am. No fear. What work situation or relationship or inner turmoil is choking the life right out of you? Take courage. I am. No fear. Take courage. He is. No fear. Grace, peace, love. Amen.